Let me show you a video first.
The death toll has surpassed 20,000.
In Gaza City, at least 17 people were killed while waiting for a humanitarian aid delivery at a major intersection.
The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza has announced that more than 30,000 Palestinians have been killed.
It is unacceptable that 7 humanitarian workers were killed trying to help people in Gaza.
So somebody decided to make a kid's book about that. Wow. Okay, but the guy brave enough to do that is unsurprising. It's Reza Aslan. He's the #1 New York Times bestseller of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. He had quite a controversy on his CNN show, Believer. He's done work with CBS, HBO. He's Peabody nominated and Emmy nominated. So Reza, welcome, brother.
Thank you, my friend. It's nice to see you.
Okay. All right, so what are you, nuts? What are you doing? A kid's book about Israel and Palestine. Okay, so tell me why you did it and what's in it.
Well, look, part of this had to do with the fact that I myself am a father of 4 kids, ranging from ages 4 to 12. And, you know, they're inundated at school, around their friends. They, see it in videos, on the news, and they're as confused as everybody else about what's going on in Gaza. And worse than that, what they hear a lot is the kind of misinformation and the dehumanizing rhetoric that is sometimes thrown around on both sides about the other. And what I wanted to do was give them a sense of how we got to where we are now in a very simple, easy to understand way, without trying to cast blame on one side or the other, or to simply state that one side is fully at fault against another. And then most importantly, what I really wanted to do was to use this conflict, the history of this conflict, as a learning tool, not as a way of saying, oh, I'm going to tell you how we're going to fix this conflict between Israel and Palestine, but rather what you can learn from it, and this kind of superpower that I think that kids have, that their ability to empathize with other people. It's a power that I think a lot of adults tend to lose after a while, but kids have this ability to always see both sides of an argument. They know what's fair. They know what's just and right. And so I just figured if you could give them the sort of the history of this conflict in an easy way to understand, then they'll be in a much more powerful place as they grow older to be the generation that maybe could do something about it.
So Reza, I read the book and it is accurate, it is truthful, it is simple and easy to understand. That's why I can't imagine it not being attacked. So I don't know if it's out enough for people to have consumed it and attacked you yet, but see, let me give you an example. So you say that when Israel was originally formed, the Palestinians were mad because they got about half the land, a little bit under half the land, when Jewish people at the time were about 1/3 of the population. So that's true, but doesn't necessarily fit the narrative of the Israeli side. And now they have way more than half the land, and the land that the Palestinians are gonna have keeps shrinking. Those things are all indisputably true, but does not fit the narrative of at least the zealots on the Israeli side. So, I mean, I can't imagine that they're gonna say, okay, we all agree Reza's book is honest and true, so go ahead, everybody buy this book. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely getting it from both sides. What I really wanted to do when I was writing this book was I wanted to make sure that I had a lot of people from all walks of life, Jews and Muslims, Israelis, Palestinians, peace activists, people who work with interfaith issues. I had everyone read it. And I took a lot of their notes, but in the end, what I couldn't help but notice is that the notes I kept getting more or less could be summarized by you're being too fair to the other side, that you're being too pro-Palestinian or too pro-Israel. And I did go in there and massage some of the language a little bit. I mean, there were some trigger words that I thought, could be massaged a little bit. But in the end, what I kind of came to realize is that if both sides are complaining that the book is too pro the other side, then maybe it's just right. And so I think that's what I was going for. But I also didn't want to shy away from some very big issues. I talk about the Holocaust in the book. I talk about the Nakba in the book. I talk about settlements and what they are doing to the Palestinian people. I talk about some Palestinian terrorism. I mean, those issues are not washed away by any means. And again, I do think that children have the complexity and the sophistication to understand these issues. And then also, let's just be honest here. Yes, it is a kid's book about Israel and Palestine, but frankly, it's as much for the parents as it is for the kids. I mean, let's face it, most parents don't understand what's going on here. And the best comments that I've gotten so far from readers has come from parents who have said, this is the first time I understood what's been going on for the last, at this point, 7 decades.
Yeah, look, that's actually totally true. If all you did was take out 10, 15 minutes to read this book, you'd get caught up on what happened with Israel and Palestine really effectively, really quickly. It gives you the essence of what happened from both sides. And look, obviously, anybody that's seen me arguing the case, whether it's on the Young Turks or in other places like Piers Morgan and all the other, dozens of places that I've done debates, you know that I have a very clear opinion on it. But Reza did not color anything. Those are actual facts, right? And there's no dispute about. I think there's no real dispute about the facts that are in Reza's book. If you're a zealot on either side, you're going to dispute no matter what. But in fact, Reza, that brings me to not just, hey, did the right-wing Israeli guy think this? Did the zealot on the Palestinian side think that? But people that are considered so-called, legitimate sources, like the New York Times, Intercept broke a story today explaining the New York Times won't call the occupied territories, because I guess because it would hurt Israel's feelings. But so what do you do in a world where they say the objective thing is to not call things what they actually are? And by the way, they also don't call refugee camps if they're regarding Palestinians. Everybody else gets to be a refugee, but not the Palestinians. So what happens when the New York Times says, I won't say things that are true, and if you're saying things that are true in your book, then we might criticize it?
Yeah, the paper of record, no less. This is a widespread problem across the media, let's be honest. The mainstream media is functioning from a position in which even today, and although I will say the pendulum has swung a little bit, but even today, the position seems to be that Israel is the legitimate national narrative and that the Palestinians are essentially interlopers. They are essentially interrupting the national narrative of Israel. And I think that was the biggest challenge in this book, was to say that, look, there's a million ways to talk about this conflict, but at its core, we have to understand that fundamentally there are two absolutely valid national narratives here. The story that Israel tells of this conflict and the story that Palestine tells of this conflict, they both are obviously coming from vastly different points of view, but they are both equally important, equally legitimate. And is there a way to lay them both out without judgment? Not to say that, okay, now that we've done this, let's figure out how to fix this problem, because, I mean, you and I have had conversations about this. I'm not sure what the fix to this problem possibly could be, though I have, some ideas. But more importantly, the book is a challenge to children and, frankly, their parents. Can you see the legitimacy of the other side? Because if you can, then that means that you have what it takes to be a peacemaker, that you have the power of empathy, that you could understand that Both sides have reason to be afraid of the other. Both sides have done many, many things wrong. But that unless we're willing to put that aside and move forward and to recognize what Israelis and Palestinians fundamentally have in common with each other, then we'll never get to a place where this conflict can be reasonably dealt with.
Yeah, especially for us in America, because we're the ones who get to decide, are we going to send them $4 billion a year, $14 billion for more weapons, et cetera? And are we going to push for a two-state solution, or are we not going to do that? And so look, I especially appreciated what you did, because we do it on the show all the time too. Hey, what if the shoe's on the other foot? And so and there's caricatures on both sides. So some on the Palestinian side will say, oh my God, the Zionists just wanted to grab the land, et cetera. No, brothers and sisters, there was a Holocaust and they suffered greatly in it, and they did want a safe haven. Now, that doesn't mean that they did everything right? And they genuinely wanted that. It wasn't just to come steal your land because they're Zionists, et cetera, et cetera. And for the Israeli side, you really think the Palestinians are the Nazis? Are you insane? They have almost no power at all. And finally, that gets to the one more thing I want to discuss with you, Reza, which is that I've been asking this on social media, and the answers are so interesting. Is Israel David or Goliath? Because it shows you how differently both sides view it. The Israeli side goes, what do you mean? Obviously we're David. The Star of David is on our flag. We're the tiny, tiny little country surrounded by enemies. We're so weak and small, and oh my God, we're about to be wiped out any second. And part of that is PTSD from the Holocaust, because they almost did get wiped out, right? And the other side goes, are you insane? You have one of the biggest militaries in the world, in the history of the world. You're backed up by the greatest military in the history of the world. You're Goliath, right? And the reality is, yeah, I can see why they both see it that way, even though there is a correct answer. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and listen, as simple as this sounds, the very ability to just see, I see why they would think themselves David, and I would see why others would think of them as Goliath. Just that ability alone is so revolutionary, especially in the United States, because listen, we have this view of this crisis, particularly because of the overwhelming evangelical Christian population of the United States, as not a conflict over land or sovereignty or politics, that this is instead a conflict over whether the word of God is true or not, that this is a conflict over whether the Bible is correct, that these aren't people on the ground fighting against each other to figure out how to split this land, but this is a cosmic battle taking place in the heavens between the forces of good and evil. Well, when you talk about any conflict in those terms, that is an unfixable conflict. There is no compromise. If what's at stake is good versus evil, there's no way to kind of, split the difference, if you will, when we're talking about good and evil. That kind of rhetoric is why we're in the situation that we're in now. And so the first challenge of this book is not to ignore the fact that there are some very serious religious issues involved here. And I talk a lot about that, the religious importance of this place that we call the Holy Land. But then to strip it of its religious significance and bring it down to issues and grievances that we can understand and actually deal with, because these grievances are real, they are legitimate, and they fuel an enormous amount of anger, hatred, and worst of all, radicalization on both sides. This war in Gaza is a perfect example of this. I mean, I understand that Netanyahu's stated goal is to wipe out Hamas, but his own military says that's impossible. We're not going to do that. Meanwhile, what is happening because of the death of now 30,000 individuals, 2/3 of whom are women and children in Gaza. Now you are creating yet another generation of dispossessed, angry, legitimately angry, and radicalized youth that is going to push the hope of any kind of compromise in this region off for another generation or more. And you were right. The United States is the 500-pound gorilla in the room. And so it is going to be Americans who are going to force our politicians to make to put the pressure necessary on Israel's very right-wing government to make the sacrifices that are going to be necessary in order to lead to any kind of solution to this conflict. Right. And last thing that I'll just say is a little hopeful comment here. I feel like it's happening. You know this as well as I do. The pendulum has really swung in this country when it comes to our views of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I remember when I was first writing about this conflict, it was hard to find anyone who didn't just believe that Israel, right or wrong, Israel can do whatever it wants to. Israel is the chosen people. They're the ones who are, the legitimate occupiers of this land, et cetera, et cetera. I don't hear that as often anymore. And even more fascinatingly, I hear it less and less from America's evangelicals, particularly younger evangelicals, who no longer see this conflict through that biblical lens, but who see it properly through the lens of what Jesus would do, right? Like, which side in this conflict would Jesus be on? The side of the massive military occupation, or the side of the person being occupied and whose rights and privileges are being denied? It's a pretty simple question to answer, if you ask.
So Reza, that's exactly what we talked about on the Young Turks earlier today, because Reverend Hagee, or Pastor Hagee, whatever his name is, for Christians United for Israel, was saying that we should level Gaza, and that Jesus would want us to destroy them.
Yes, Jesus would want us to massacre 1 million people, mostly women and children. That's what Jesus would want.
Yeah, I mean, and he's pretending that Jesus was not the Prince of Peace, but wanted death and destruction, et cetera. It's amazing to see with your own eyes. But I totally agree with you. Pendulum is swinging. A lot of the right wing is not in that camp anymore. And they're not in the camp of let's do endless wars on behalf of Israel or anyone else. The neocons, the oil companies, et cetera. The media coverage has been a little bit more fair in this conflict, which is amazing. And I'll end on this. And to the audience, you don't have to agree with the one side in order to understand them. So for example, I know that Israel is Goliath. In this scenario, they are not David, in my opinion. They are definitely Goliath. Factually speaking, militarily speaking, there's no question they're Goliath. But I understand why they think they're David. And that's still important so that you can begin to communicate in a way that addresses their concerns and gets you to a meeting of the minds so we could finally get to peace. Does that make sense to you, Reza?
100%. I mean, that's the entire thesis of the book. Is you might have your own ideas, you may have your own views of this conflict, but can you just for a moment put yourself in the other's shoes and understand how they might look at this? And when you do, then that's it. That's it. That's the first step to figuring out what to do with this conflict. And it's a step that unfortunately our own political leaders, both in the Congress and even in the White House, seem to have a very difficult time doing.
Yeah, and you might be able to take that first step if you read a kid's book about Israel and Palestine. Reza Aslan, thank you for joining us again. Appreciate it, brother.
Anytime, my friend.